The bolt carrier group landed in the old man's lap with a hollow clunk, and neither Brady Lennox nor Chase Dunfield bothered waiting to see what he'd do with it. They were already walking away, shoulders bent together, laughing with the particular confidence of men who have never been wrong about anything important. The old man sitting on the wooden bench near the equipment tables looked down at the scattered components without expression, his hands, large, deeply weathered, with the particular stillness of hands that had learned long ago not to move unless they meant it, rested on either side of the pile. He didn't touch anything. Not yet. He simply looked. And the quality of that look, had anyone been paying close enough attention, was not the bewilderment of a man who didn't understand what he was holding. It was the slow, certain recognition of a man who had been exactly here before. His name was Garrison Wade Holt. 74 years old, he wore a grey wool shirt, washed so many times it had forgotten its original colour, work pants with a careful mend at the left knee, and boots that had been resoled twice and were working on a third. His white hair needed cutting. His beard, the same colour, was the only thing about him that suggested any remaining vanity, kept short and clean. That small discipline still intact when everything else had come undone. He had driven 3 hours from his house outside of Butte to reach the Copper Creek Open, Montana's largest precision rifle championship. He had not registered to compete. He had paid the $5 spectator admission at the gate, accepted a paper wristband from a teenager who didn't look up from her phone, and found a bench near the equipment staging area where he could sit without being in anyone's way. That had been the plan. Sit, watch, be that still felt like himself. His wife, Loretta, had died 11 weeks ago. 49 years of marriage, and then a Tuesday afternoon in October when she simply wasn't there anymore. The house in Butte was so quiet he had started leaving the television on just to fill the rooms. He didn't watch it. He just needed the sound of something living. He had come to the Copper Creek Open because he didn't know what else to do with a Saturday in November. The tournament was impressive by any measure. 230 competitors from 20 states, prize money that would have seemed absurd to Holt when he was young, equipment that cost more than most people's first homes. Young men and women in custom shooting jerseys moved through the staging area with the practiced ease of athletes who knew they were being watched. They discussed barrel harmonics and chamber pressures with the fluency of people who had grown up online, in forums, in a world where information had always been free and available, and delivered at whatever depth you wanted. They were good. Some of them were genuinely excellent. None of them paid any attention to the old man on the bench. The tournament director was a man named Rick Stanton, 51, built like someone who had once been athletic and was slowly negotiating with that fact. Wearing a Copper Creek open polo shirt and carrying a clipboard with the focused authority of a man who had assigned himself too many responsibilities to delegate. He had served 4 years in the Army in the early 90s, a fact he mentioned to most people within the first 10 minutes of meeting them. He had never been in combat. He ran a successful sporting goods business in Billings and organized the Copper Creek Open every year with genuine pride and an organizational style that ran about 30% efficiency and 70% visible effort. When one of the range volunteers flagged him down to ask about the old man sitting alone near the staging area, "He's just been there since we opened, Rick. Doesn't seem to know anyone." Stanton glanced over, made the rapid assessment of a man with a full clipboard and 46 more things to manage, and shook his head. "He's got a wristband. Leave him alone." He went back to his clipboard. The dismissive efficiency of that moment would sit uncomfortably with Rick Stanton for a long time afterward. Brady Lennox noticed the old man about an hour into the morning warm-up session. Brady was 23, third ranked in his regional division, sponsored by 2 different optics companies whose logos featured prominently on every piece of clothing he owned. He was talented, genuinely, objectively talented, in the way that sometimes makes a person certain they are better than they are. His shooting partner and best friend Chase Dunfield was 22 and had been following Brady's red on most situations since they were 14 years old. Brady had been running his bolt action through a magazine of warm-up rounds at lane 7 when he became gradually aware of the old man watching from 20 yards away. Not staring, just watching with the relaxed attentiveness of someone watching weather roll in across a valley. Calm, unhurried, like he had nowhere better to be and nothing better to do, and had made peace with both of those facts. It bothered Brady in the vague, unlocatable way that things you can't explain will bother you. "Who is that?" he said to Chase during a break. Chase looked. "No idea, just some guy. He's been sitting there since I got here. He's got a wristband, probably just a retiree, nothing to do." They might have left it there, they should have left it there, but Brady's eye caught the reject table near the equipment area. A surface cluttered with rifles pulled from competition for mechanical failures. The worst of them was a bolt action that a competitor had attempted to modify himself, creating a trigger group that worked unpredictably in the specific way that amateur gunsmithing produces, intermittently and without warning. The range armourer had tagged it, set it aside, and moved on. Nobody was going near it. Brady picked it up. He carried it over to the old man on the bench with the casual generosity of someone presenting a gag gift at an office party. "Hey," he said, holding the rifle out. "You look like you know guns. Think you can figure out what's wrong with this one? It's been giving everyone trouble all morning." He said it the way you'd ask a stranger to help carry something trivially heavy, as a small performance, not a real request. Chase stood a few paces behind, the corner of his mouth already moving. The old man looked up at Brady for a moment. Then he looked at the rifle. He reached out and took it. His hands moved across the weapon with an immediacy that had nothing to do with curiosity. It was purposeful in the way that a doctor's hands are purposeful when they lift a patient's wrist to check a pulse. Not exploratory, not demonstrative, just working. He turned the rifle over once, ran a thumb along the receiver, worked the bolt without chambering it, tilted the muzzle slightly toward the light and looked into the action. "Sure," he said to no one in particular. His voice was quiet. Brady and Chase exchanged a look and drifted back toward the water table, where they leaned against the railing with their drinks and settled in to watch with the comfortable expectation of people who know how the joke ends. What happened next was not a joke. Garrison Wade Holt set the rifle across his knees and began to work. No tools, no bench block, no vise, no armourer's kit, no manual open to any page. Just his hands and whatever lived in those hands after 5 decades of accumulated knowledge pressing itself into muscle and bone until it no longer required conscious direction. He field stripped the rifle with the economy of someone removing a shoelace, each component separated cleanly, placed along the bench beside him in a sequence that followed its own logic. A logic that was entirely legible to anyone who had done this long enough. 30 seconds. The major assemblies laid out in a row with the particular precision of a surgical tray. No fumbling, no hesitation, no sound except the soft mechanical whisper of the components separating. People began to notice. The competitors nearest the staging area stopped talking first. Then the ones beyond them, pulled by the quality of the silence spreading outward. There is something in watching genuine mastery that produces its own gravity, a hush that moves through a crowd without anyone choosing to go quiet. A woman at the adjacent table lowered the rifle she'd been cleaning. 2 range volunteers stopped walking mid-step. Rick Stanton emerged from the registration tent without quite deciding to the way you move towards something you don't yet understand you need to see. Holt found the problem in under a minute. The trigger group had been partially disassembled and reassembled by someone who had watched a video online and overestimated what that prepared them for. A transfer bar seated in the wrong orientation. Spring tension set so far off the specification that the firing mechanism had become essentially a coin flip. He had seen this before, not once or twice, more times than he could count, over more decades than some of these competitors had been alive. He began correcting it. His fingers moved in adjustments so small they were nearly invisible from a distance, not the deliberate gestures of someone performing for a crowd, but the tiny certain work of a man whose hands had long since learned to see on their own. He tested spring tension against the pad of his thumb, aligned the transfer bar by feel, making micro-corrections with a pressure so controlled it looked effortless. He tilted the bolt face toward the November light and examined it with his eyes half closed, the way a jeweler examines a setting. Brady Lennox had put his water bottle down. At 90 seconds, Holt began reassembling the rifle. This part was faster, components returning to their positions in a sequence of clean, unhesitating clicks that came so quickly and evenly they sounded almost mechanical themselves, no second guessing. No backtracking, just assembly, each piece finding its place with the inevitability of something going home. The crowd had grown to 40 people, then more. A cluster of competitors from the far lanes had drifted over without quite noticing they'd left their positions. At just over 2 minutes, Garrison Wade Holt stood up from the bench. He held the rifle for a moment, worked the bolt 3 times in the calm, checking way of a man performing a final verification, and walked to the nearest open lane. The range safety officer started to say something. Something in the way the old man moved, not aggressively, not rudely, simply without any trace of uncertainty about what he was doing or whether he belonged there, made the range officer stop and take 1 step back. Holt loaded a single cartridge. He did not set up a rest. He did not adjust a bipod or ask for support equipment of any kind. He raised the rifle to his shoulder with a motion so practiced it appeared involuntary, settled into a standing position that 2 of the biomechanics coaches in the crowd would later agree was technically as clean as anything they had ever observed, and fired. The steel target at 300 yards rang out flat and hard in the cold air. Center hit. He worked the bolt, loaded another round, fired. Center hit. Again. 5 shots. 5 rounds that would have been considered exceptional from a supported prone position with a personal rifle dialed to familiar loads. Fired standing, with a rifle he'd held for the first time 11 minutes ago, in conditions that had already produced 2 equipment malfunctions from other competitors that morning. 5 hits in a group so tight that the range officer, who walked down range afterward to examine the target, stood looking at it for a long moment before he turned back to the crowd. Nobody spoke. Holt engaged the safety. He walked back across the quiet range and held the rifle out to Brady Lennox, who took it the way you take something being returned to you that you didn't fully understand you'd given away. The old man turned toward his bench. Rick Stanton stepped into his path. Stanton's clipboard was hanging forgotten at his side. His face had gone through several different arrangements in the past 2 minutes and hadn't settled on one. When he spoke, his voice came out quieter than he expected. "Sir, I should have asked when you came in. Can I ask your name?" The old man looked at him. Those grey, steady eyes, carrying that permanent quality of sadness, met Stanton's and held them. "Garrison Holt," he said. The sound that moved through the assembled crowd was not quite a gasp. It was the collective intake of breath that precedes one. Several of the older competitors, men and women in their 40s and 50s, people who had been in the long-range shooting community for decades, went very still in the specific way of people processing information that changes the shape of what they're looking at. A man nearby, 60 years old, 3-time national champion, said, "Oh God," with complete sincerity. Rick Stanton's clipboard hit the ground. He didn't notice. Master Sergeant Garrison Holt, of the 75th Ranger Regiment. Holt said nothing. He didn't need to. The name moved through the crowd in waves, the way significant names do when they reach people who understand their weight. Garrison Wade Holt. 22 years in the United States Army, 8 combat deployments across 4 decades of American military history, senior marksmanship instructor at the Army Sniper School at Fort Benning for 11 years. The man who had written the qualification standard that every Army marksman still trained against. A document so precise and so comprehensive that it remained in active use 40 years after the day he'd finished writing it, sitting alone at a kitchen table in a rented house near Post because he couldn't sleep. The man who had trained, directly or indirectly, more combat snipers than anyone else in Army history. The man whose record for the longest confirmed Ranger sniper engagement had stood for 26 years before it was broken by a soldier Holt himself had trained. Brady Lennox stood with the rifle in his hands and looked like a man watching the ground move. Before the silence had finished settling, they heard a vehicle. A dark government SUV came through the main gate with the unhurried deliberateness of vehicles that carry their own authority with them. It stopped near the equipment area. The door opened. The man who stepped out was in his late 40s, wearing army dress greens heavy with the accumulated weight of a full career, a full bird colonel. He moved across the gravel with purpose, scanning the crowd with the eyes of someone looking for a specific face. He found it. Colonel Dwayne Prescott, Fort Benning, current commander of the Ranger Training Brigade, crossed the range and came to a halt 6 feet from Garrison Wade Holt. He came to attention with the sharpness of someone for whom this was not ceremony but instinct, and rendered a salute that had no performance in it whatsoever. Master Sergeant Holt, his voice carried across the range cleanly, without effort. Sir, I received word you were here. I drove up from Billings this morning. Holt returned the salute. The motion reached back through decades of repetition and executed itself. Colonel Prescott, a pause. You didn't need to make the drive. With respect, sir, yes, I did. Prescott lowered his salute but held his bearing. You trained me, summer of 2001, Fort Benning. I was a lieutenant with considerably more confidence than the situation warranted, and you spent 6 weeks addressing both problems. Something moved through the colonel's composure, not quite emotion, but the honest shadow of it. 4 months after I left your school, I was in Afghanistan. What you taught me in those 6 weeks kept me and 6 of my men alive in separate engagements across 2 deployments. I've thought about that with regularity ever since, and I have never had the opportunity to say thank you properly. The range was completely still. Even the wind for a moment seemed to consider pausing. Holt looked at the colonel for a long moment. The sadness in those eyes remained. It was always there now, a permanent resident, but something else moved through it briefly. The quiet satisfaction of a craftsman who learns that something he built has held up under the weight it was designed to bear. How are your men, Colonel? Sharp, Master Sergeant. We make sure of it. Holt nodded once. Then you said thank you the right way. Prescott turned to the assembled crowd. He did not raise his voice, but the quality of his attention made continued silence feel necessary. I want to make certain everyone here understands who is standing in front of you, he said. Garrison Wade Holt, 4 wars, 22 years of service, 8 combat deployments, 11 years as a senior instructor at the United States Army Sniper School, where he trained over 300 snipers, a number of whom are still serving today, and some of whom gave their lives in the kind of work his training prepared them for. He holds the Distinguished Marksman Badge, the Combat Infantryman Badge with 3 stars, the Silver Star, 3 Bronze Stars with Valor, and the Purple Heart. The qualification standard you're competing against today, if you've passed through any Army marksmanship program in the last 4 decades, is his. He paused, and when he continued, his voice was quieter. And you handed him a broken rifle as a joke. Brady Lennox stepped forward before anyone else could move. His voice broke on the first syllable. Sir, Master Sergeant, I'm sorry. I am genuinely sorry. There's nothing I can say that makes that okay, and I know that. He stopped, swallowed. We didn't know who you were. No, Holt said. You didn't. He looked at Brady, and then at Chase, and then at the wider circle of faces around him, young competitors, older ones, volunteers, sponsors, Rick Stanton still standing there with his clipboard on the ground. You saw an old man in worn-out clothes sitting on a bench by himself, and you made an assumption. His voice was unhurried, no heat in it. That's a natural thing to do. The problem isn't that you made it. The problem is what you decided to do with it. He paused. In the field, in the dark, in a place where the cost of underestimating someone is measured differently than it is here, that same assumption, made the same way, gets people killed. I've seen it. That's not a figure of speech. He picked up his jacket from the bench. Don't judge capacity by appearance. Don't judge knowledge by what someone's wearing. And don't assume that age has taken something from a person until you've looked close enough to actually know. He said it the way you say something true that you have earned the right to say, without drama, without the need for anyone to respond, as a final instruction that either lands or doesn't. Rick Stanton cleared his throat. He had recovered something of himself, though his clipboard was still on the ground. Master Sergeant Holt. His voice was careful now, the way you carry something you don't want to drop. We would be honored if you'd agree to compete today. Same rules, same field, whatever you want, please. Holt considered this. His eyes moved across the range, the lanes, the targets in the distance, the steel plates glinting in the low November sun. He had not come here to compete. He had come here to feel like himself for a few hours. Same division as everyone else, he said. Same rules, same equipment standards. I'm not shooting in a special category. Stanton nodded immediately. Yes, sir. Absolutely. What Garrison Wade Holt did over the following 3 hours at the Copper Creek Open would be described and debated in precision shooting circles for years after that November Saturday. He borrowed a rifle from a competition sponsor, standard production, factory specification, nothing personal or adjusted to his preferences, a gun that belonged to no one and had been sighted in by a stranger. He shot it against 230 competitors with purpose-built, custom rifles, in a wind that came down out of the Rockies in the afternoon and made the longer distance stages genuinely unforgiving. He did not dominate every stage. He was 74, and there were stages where his scores were excellent but not untouchable, where age and time away from competition showed at the edges. But what he brought to every stage, without exception, was a quality that no custom trigger or premium barrel could produce. A stillness under pressure so complete it seemed less like discipline and more like a permanent state of being. Wind calls that made younger competitors hesitate, he made without visible deliberation. Position transitions that demanded physical flexibility took him a moment longer but produced no loss of precision at the end. When the conditions worsened in the final hour and scores across the field dropped by a measurable margin, his held. By the time the final stage scores were compiled, he led the open division by a margin that left no room for argument. Between stages he talked to people, not lecturing, not holding court. Just answering questions when they were asked, offering a word when he could see someone struggling with something specific and correctable. Brady Lennox spent most of the midday break within earshot of Holt without asking anything directly, just listening to the answers other competitors received. By mid-afternoon, he had worked up the nerve to ask about wind holds at the 400-yard line in variable gusts. Holt answered him in precise, practical language, the way someone answers when they have accumulated so much knowledge they can afford to give it freely, without keeping score. When the final scores were announced, and Garrison Wade Holt's name was called as tournament champion, the applause started at full volume and did not diminish for a long time. He accepted the trophy with a quiet nod and shook hands with Stanton and the competition judges. He was ready to leave before the crowd had finished dispersing. Colonel Prescott walked with him to the parking lot. "Master Sergeant, the Army is organizing a recognition ceremony in the spring. Former instructors whose work shaped the sniper program. Your name is first on the list." Prescott paused. "Will you attend?" Holt looked at the Rockies to the west. The sun was already pulling itself below the ridgeline, and the cold was coming in earnest now, the particular cold of Montana in November that doesn't negotiate. "I'll be there," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "Loretta would have told me I had to go. She never let me turn down the ones that mattered." Prescott didn't ask who Loretta was. He heard everything he needed to in the way the name was said, the particular tenderness of a man speaking a name that now lives entirely in the past tense. "Then we'll see you in the spring." Holt got into his truck. The engine turned over cleanly on the first try. He sat for a moment before putting it in gear, looking through the windshield at the range, at the competitors still gathered in small groups in the fading light, at the equipment tables being broken down by volunteers, at the bench near the staging area where he'd spent the morning, trying to remember what it felt like to be himself. He had fixed the rifle because it needed fixing, and because a tool deserves to work the way it was designed to. He had shot because someone offered him a lane, and it had been a long time. He had said what he said to Brady Lennox because the boy was young enough that the lesson could still take root in something important. None of it had been about proving anything. He had stopped needing to prove things to other people sometime in his late 20s, in a country far from Montana, under circumstances he had never described to anyone except Loretta. He put the truck in gear and turned toward the highway. Behind him, Rick Stanton stood near the equipment staging area, holding the broken rifle, the one the old man had fixed in 2 minutes and change using nothing but his hands and the 50 years those hands carried. Stanton turned it over slowly, the way you handle something that has become more than what it started as. Around him, volunteers broke down tables and competitors loaded gear into truck beds, and the conversation everywhere was about what they'd seen, what it meant, what they would tell people when they got home. Stanton already knew what he was going to do with the rifle. He was going to have it mounted. He was going to have a small plaque made for it, the kind that says something plain and true. He hadn't worked out the exact words yet, but he knew they would say something about seeing and not seeing, about what you miss when you decide you already know what you're looking at. He thought he'd keep it simple. He thought that was probably what the old man would have wanted.